My name is J Mac. My pronouns are he and him. And I'm going to turn it over to my special guest. We're going to have a really quick chat with this wonderful person today.
Wow. My name is Olivia and she and her.
And Olivia is the executive director of Pride Toronto.
Yeah, I am indeed. Sorry, I forgot to say that.
That's all right. We all forget where we are some days, right?
You know how it is.
Just depends on how many glasses of wine I've had.
Quite.
Right. So we're really excited because we got an opportunity to talk to Olivia, and we wanted. You took over a couple of years ago now.
I did.
And Pride Toronto has gone through many things.
I love the way you put that, Jason. Yeah, many things.
Right?
That's right.
Let's talk a little bit about, you took over a couple of years ago, and your first year was off to the race, is my best way to put it. Like jump in both feet and sink or swim. So tell us a little bit about your first year, just kind of taking over and getting into this.
Well, I started in February, and so it was 4 months before this festival was actually meant to be put on, because it was June 1st, so we had like 3 months. I just started the position. The organization had not really been operating, and I mean, I'd have to go a couple of steps back, as you do. So obviously in 2016, before I began, Pride Toronto was protested by Black Lives Matter. And the protest was really about the treatment of queer communities of color. And so, the organization found itself kind of in the midst of philosophical dilemma, so to speak. And then I started February of 2017. And so really all I could do was really put the festival on. And so it was about 3 or 4 months of kind of chaos. And then we managed to kind of pull out a festival June 1st to whenever it ended, June 30th, 2017. And really, I was quite off to the races, because obviously the first thing we needed to think about was what we were going to do about our situation with the police and how we were going to move forward with that. And so, the two things we had to deal with was putting on a party and policing.
Right. Nice. What a way to start.
Exactly.
And I mean, Pride Toronto's had some struggles in the past. We know that. And I mean, it wasn't the easiest takeover for anybody in any position, I don't think. And I think there's some confusion around Black Lives Matter, because I mean, personally, it took me a little while to kind of understand that Black Lives Matter and persons of color feel like they were in such a desperate position to be heard that they needed to do a protest within a protest kind of thing.
Yes.
And maybe you can touch a little bit about that, of how that kind of transpires, and what has that done for the person of color who's queer.
I don't even know where to begin, really, on the impact of, well, not only the question, but the impact of it on queer communities of color. I would certainly argue that this movement struggles, or has struggled, continues to struggle, with quantifying its own privilege. And it's certainly it's difficult conceptually for all of us to grapple with the fact that often movements, they move quicker or slower depending on who you're moving. And in this case, I would argue that many movements that have been successful, both now and in the past, the ones that tend to, let's say, move along quicker, are ones where perhaps communities of color don't tend to form the central focus of those movements. One could argue the same in the LGBTQ2+ community. That in fact it was, while there is always a fight for equality across this whole community, when the people that you're fighting for are people of color, it seemingly is a lot harder, and it's a lot harder because racism really isn't discriminatory.
Wow, yeah, that's for sure. And I mean, let's face it, I mean, the queer community does have some struggle about complete inclusion and working with everybody. I know as a older gay white male, I do know that we take up a lot of space sometimes, and we forget there's other people. And I know over the last few years that I've gotten more mature in that and understanding. And now I'm looking at that protest that delayed the Pride Parade for 30 minutes as, wow, so it inconvenienced us for 30 minutes, but the point was made that, persons of color that are queer need to be heard and be included, and that's important because we're all a community and we need to support each other. So hopefully, from that step forward,
Yes,
that we start
yes.
recognizing that as a community, especially within the LGBT community, because if we appear divided, we're going to be attacked, and we do see that starting to come out, especially with current governments and different things and hate and everything that's kind of going on. So
yes, absolutely. And like you say, if some of us aren't equal, all of us aren't equal.
That's right.
And you're absolutely right that in the sense that, when Black Lives Matter protested the parade, and it's as much about protesting the parade as it is about also the Black community seeing Black queer people willing to take up space as Black queer people. Because
that is true, because a lot of
Exactly.
persons of colors are very scared to come forward and actually speak up. I found over especially the last couple of years.
It definitely takes being in the closet, so to speak, takes on different dynamics in different communities. Absolutely, and in this sense, and I don't even know if I wouldn't argue for me personally. Watching young queer Black people take up space as young queer Black people, I think was inspirational for anybody Black and queer, and certainly in the context of pride movements, I would argue all over the world. What Black Lives Matter did in Toronto, I think is history making.
And let's face it, you put together and pulled that off in 4 months, the biggest pride events in the country.
I have to say to you that the volunteer team in this organization is second to none. And I honestly believe it would have happened even if I wasn't here. Because this volunteer team so understand the nuts and bolts of this festival that you honestly wonder if you're not just kind of, honestly just mouthing words.
You're just here to look pretty.
Exactly, while everybody does
right?
the work. And that's exactly true for Pride Toronto. Absolutely. So yeah, for sure, I would argue that as with all prides, that the volunteer teams that make up all prides are the reason why, despite whatever goes on politically, these events will always happen.
Well, that's good to hear.
Yeah.
So it seems like the kind of like what we've watched over the last couple of years around media and Pride Toronto, it seems like you don't even get out of the gate and the media's already got you pegged doing something or other that's just completely contrary to what you're actually doing.
I have to tell you, this is my bugbear to end all bugbears, is the fact that this community is complex and it's nuanced and it's is as much cohesive as it is divided, but it certainly doesn't make for a soundbite. And what we're trying to do here is something deeper and more meaningful. And so you're absolutely right.
Well, I think that's what happened with the Toronto Police Service, because you were engaged in some really good conversation about changing how they were thinking about the queer community and how to become involved and being more inclusive. I think that's where the conversations you were having.
Absolutely.
And I, from what I understand, you actually said, okay, you're making these steps, we're showing progress, we're going to allow you to apply to be in the parade, but that does not guarantee.
Exactly.
But when the media got a hold of it...
Exactly, Jason. Exactly, Jason.
So the more I looked into it, I was like, wow, this is like really bizarre, which completely divided the community all over again, which is what it seemed that the media was trying to do.
And did so
did I say
Did you?
Oops.
Do you keep anything inside, Jason?
I try not to.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe... So what's the impact of that relationship with the police service? And you were making progress with about inclusion, and now where are you at? Because now they've gotten totally trashed in the communities, so they weren't recognized anymore for the steps they were trying to take and correct and move forward to be more inclusive around the LGBT community. So where's that at now? Like, the damage that they've done is what I'm really curious about.
Yes, and I think you're astute because we definitely have to reframe that relationship and decide what our starting point is all over again. I think it's a worthy thing to do because I think what ultimately the membership and then more broadly the community exposed, was and thankfully there was, or maybe not so thankfully, but there was a real life example. And obviously what Bruce MacArthur ended up signifying was the very disquiet that the community felt.
Right.
And to feel that so recent, it was then hard to talk about progress when at the very same time you're trying to signal progress, there are a number of symbols of why the problem is so deep and so lasting. And so where are we now? We have to, we are all committed to moving this thing forward. It's a commitment of mine. It's a commitment of the membership and of the broader community. They want to feel protected. They want to feel equal, and they don't feel that at the moment. And so we're all committed to making sure that we are able to bring steps of appreciable change, but we also all recognize that without those steps of appreciable change, we're going nowhere very quickly.
Right. So basically, you're back to the drawing board all over again, and hopefully the Toronto Police Service will actually engage in those conversations again, so that we can start seeing that movement towards what everybody's actually after. And that's not to say there's good police officers in there. Why is the community so divided? Because one of the things I've learned in my life, if you can't include somebody in a conversation, how are you going to educate them to what you need or what you're after?
Oh, Jason. Man,
not to complicate your life or anything.
But that was the reason that we thought it was worthy to invite them to apply. For sure, one of the things that I put
Let's
forward,
just make sure that everybody's got that. They were invited to apply, but that was no guarantee they were in the parade.
That was no guarantee,
right.
And it was, it was funny. There was a moment in that press conference where I actually say, they've been invited to apply. There's still a process that the membership has to engage in. But like you say, as things sort of roll out through the media, those things become less and less significant. Nonetheless, the symbol of even inviting them to apply was weighty enough to open up the conversation. And it is my view that you cannot make change unless you are sitting around the table with people, grappling with the things that make it hard to reach equality. And certainly, even though those conversations are difficult, they never happen unless you're sitting around the same table at the same time. I often, talked about the kind of biggest sort of peace treaties that have been brokered over the years of either Civil War or World War. And the only way change happens is when you decide that it's worthwhile to sit around the table and broker that change. And I think in relation to the police, I think so many lives depend on it, that somebody's got to put the first foot forward and try to realize that change.
Well, and unfortunately, the one thing is when we're in trouble,
they're the only people
we
you can
call.
Exactly.
And I think
they
that's
are the law,
yeah.
literally.
Yeah, so you're kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place.
You are, because at the same time, if they're harming you when you're calling them, then that's not a choice.
And we're certainly not discarding anybody's trouble or issues that they've had with police. I mean, the bathhouse raids is a prime example of a time when things were not going so well for the queer community.
Even though it was legal. Right,
yeah, I know. Yeah, because that's an interesting... I watched Tom on Breakfast TV, and he was actually talking about the Parameter coin and how they've got the history wrong because it actually didn't change until way after 50 years about the laws and
you
stuff.
see the apology.
Right.
All of those people in the room wouldn't have said that they were experiencing legal freedom.
Right, that's right, yeah. So where do you think it's going to go from here? Like, are you going to continue to engage in that conversation, well, hopefully, and engage the community? Because I do know that you are talking to the community, because I've talked to people in the community.
I'm
they said,
they say you're out
in
the pavement. Yeah, for sure.
But it's got to be overwhelming and frustrating at times that there's
so
just so many things, so many different groups of individuals that are looking for representation in an organization. So how are you managing that? That's the hardest thing. That's the hardest part. And pride is pride, and so it has its own history. And managing its own history and trying to engage the community in meaningful ways is difficult. But in saying all of that, it's this is the goal. Right? You're doing this work because you want everybody to realize what they want for their own lives. And it means you have to necessarily engage
with the things that have made it hard for them to do that. And often I find that people are too quick to make negative the very things that have to be put on the table in order to move forward with reconciliation. So what I'm most proud about in terms of this organization is that people will say it here. They will open, and I honestly think it's a privilege that people are willing to put their own selves and identity on the line for actually an organization that means a great deal to them. And I say there are very few organizations in public life that people care as much about in relation to the lifeline it gives them in terms of their identity. So
that's so well said. Like, that's amazing. I was just thinking of that. I'm so glad you read my mind.
Of course, of course.
We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be right back after a few minutes. So we've come back from break, and we were kind of talking about everything that kind of over the last couple of years. But I kind of want to talk a little bit about this year, because this year's exciting, but you're also trying to make sure your ends meet, because financially we all know that Pride Toronto's had some challenges in the financial for years. It hasn't just been the past couple of years, it's been for a long time. Right. It didn't get here on its own, and it's not on you, although I've heard some people say it's your fault.
Yeah, exactly.
But let's be real, it's not you, and it's not, you are human, and I think people need to be reminded that you are a human being, right? With emotion and love and all those good things, right? Exactly. But let's talk a little bit about this year. This year is kind of exciting because you're kind of in the process of change for Pride Toronto. So how is this year? I mean, you cut down stages, a little bit more focused on some around issues, I think, is kind of the start where we're starting to see that. Actually, because we noticed it in posts. Yeah, exactly. Right. So maybe you want to touch a little bit on that.
Sure. So the one thing I would say is the 50th anniversary of Stonewall has definitely been seminal in terms of Black Lives Matter. So it happened in 2016. And so centering that voice and that identity is incredibly important to us this year. But also more broadly, what we're trying to do is elevate or heighten the visibility for our local performers, our local drag performers, our local ambassadors, people who are living out this identity in the most positive way they can. And so we are really centering the kind of queer artist of color, and we are looking specifically at creating a much more street party, street vibe feel. We are definitely focused on queer collectives of color that do kind of raves and underground parties and really trying to get more intimate. You're getting back to your teenage years, exactly. We're going way back to go forward, for sure. But we also feel like this is more the heart of what this community wants to see in terms of more intimate, more spaces that value identity and that value the notion of consent more. And so we are headlong in that direction. But we're also trying to, you're absolutely right, center also the issues that matter to the community. And I am so glad that you said your posts. I am so glad, because you are absolutely right. The idea here for Pride is to make space for a radical kind of intersectionality. Right. For an intersectionality that doesn't have to be clearly labeled, that kind of symbolic LGBTQ2+, while that's supposed to encompass a lot of groups, actually has kind of one type. And what we are trying to do is broaden the conversation to actually suggest queerness comes in different communities in different ways. And we have to respect culture as much as we respect sexual and gender identity. And certainly for communities of color, culture matters. It matters a great deal. And so what we are trying to do is say throughout our entire event, culture matters, race matters, and those things matter in addition to sexual and gender identity. And if you're a queer person of color, you want the LGBTQ2+ movement to elevate all of those elements of a personality, as opposed to, if you like, venerate just one or the other.
Wow. That is so cool. I think that's got to be the best thing I've heard in a long time.
Wow, great.
No, actually, because it's getting back to very grassroots.
Yes, that's what it's doing.
And people forget that the parties, we have things to celebrate, absolutely, no question about it. But overall, Pride came out of political activism.
Exactly.
About a fight for equality and being attacked as being an individual of who you are.
Exactly. And here we are in a changing political, economic world climate. And sure enough, this community can always rely on going back to its roots. And its roots is that of protest, but of also elevating people within the community who are more marginalized than others. And this Pride, and certainly for our 40th birthday next year, is going to elevate it and then elevate it even further.
Yeah, so we've got to keep reminding people that political activism is the basis of Pride.
Exactly.
So as you move forward, now I'm excited about this year because we're actually going to be here and working with you and Pride and all the organizations and stuff. Some people have forgotten that there's this huge relationship with the labor unions.
Yes.
And the importance of that relationship, because it started with the miners' strike in England, where the gays and lesbians were raising money for the miners, and the miners wouldn't take the money because they were gay and lesbian. So if anybody wants to know the story, they can watch Pride.
Exactly.
It's a great movie. But there's a prime example of somebody, your biggest ally, and we don't want to isolate them because they are actually one of the biggest supporters of Pride and the LGBT+ community. So how do you get back to those base roots with like the labor unions and stuff? Because that's going to be really important moving forward.
It is, for me, a significant priority. To be truthful with you, I just finished telling you about all of the different communities that make up this great community. And one of the ways that we are going to look at reaching out to communities, all communities, is through our valued relationship with the labor movement. We know what the labor movement is. It protects us at times when perhaps those protections seem negotiable. And what we want to do is not only work with unions, but work with the members within those unions to begin to not only have a greater presence as the LGBTQ+ community in places that are not traditional to us, but also ask ourselves why those places aren't traditional to us. Figure out what it is creates a barrier for us to outreach to those places and actually start to do that. And so working with the labor movement, we want to do a number of things. First of all, we want to clearly be aligned with a movement that is aligned with the notion of human rights, dignity, and equity. But also we want to start to work with our labor partners, to start to look at some of our relationships with our corporate partners. We want to understand the kind of organizations, the kind of corporations we support, and whether they align with our values. And we honestly think that working with the labor movement will allow us not only to in-reach to communities that aren't traditional for this movement, but also fight for the rights that are important to our allies. And certainly the labor movement is one of those.
Interesting that you bring up corporate sponsorship, because you kind of touched on that a little bit. And I think this is really important because there's a lot of controversy around corporate sponsorship in Pride. I'm kind of getting the impression by this conversation that you're kind of changing the direction when it comes to corporate sponsorship after getting through this year. Maybe you want to touch a little bit about on like what you see as the future with Pride and corporate sponsorships. I mean, because let's face it, we got bills to pay.
Yes, quite.
They don't let us throw all these parties for free.
For nothing.
Yeah,
exactly, exactly.
And, I mean, I do know that some are ticketed, but they're very low compared to what it would cost otherwise.
Yes. We absolutely, one of the things we're recognizing is that we are in a changing social and economic climate. And that is becoming harsher towards our community. And so we want to start looking at those corporations that have supported us, to start to ask real questions about how they can deepen their support as a result of what's happening to this community globally. We want a corporate partner that aligns with our goals, but not just says it, not just puts up a banner, but actually goes deeper and attempts to do something about it.
So they're actually living and breathing the inclusion part that you're talking about.
Exactly. And we want our contracts to be predicated on those things. And so moving out of this festival and into the next, we will definitely, and you'll see examples of it actually at this festival, but more broadly, we will be looking for a deeper form of engagement that's as much about ensuring that eyes get on people's brands as it is about ensuring that you're actually making deep and meaningful relationships inside of the community for real change.
And then this steps toward more inclusive environment. And it's funny, when we talk about inclusive, we're not just talking about the queer community after all. It's in everybody, every walk of life.
Whatever works for the queer community works for everybody.
That's right.
And that's exactly what we're doing. What we're saying is this is not LGBTQ2+ specific. What we're saying is our movement is based on the rights and dignity of absolutely everybody, including our community.
Well, that's amazing. So it would be like a whole world where we all sit around and hold hands and...
That's what you'd like to hope. That's what you'd like to hope. Yeah, exactly. Or at least be able to healthily call people out for what they're not doing. And certainly we know that one of the biggest bugbears this community has is pink washing. And so we need to deal with that head on.
Right. Wow. So you have some pretty tall goals.
Exactly.
By the looks
Exactly.
Of it. So, Olivia, if you had a chance to if you were sitting one-on-one with the queer community right now in Toronto and knowing all the stuff that's kind of gone over the last couple of years and knowing where you want to go, I mean, because it's exciting where you want to go, because I like the grassroots kind of stuff. I don't know if anybody knows that, but I do.
I think we do, Jason.
Right?
To be truthful.
Right? It's not like I go talk to anybody.
Yeah, no.
But what would you say? So if I'm the queer community, I'm just saying I'm that one person that you're going to everybody in the community, you're getting that chance to have that conversation with them. What would you say to them? Like what?
Wow.
Like this is like a huge thing. Like you're just talking one-on-one.
Yeah.
And kind of give them like your thoughts, and reminding them that you are human. That you get frustrated just like everybody else. You love just like everybody else. You have family just like everybody else. But what would be the one thing that you would say to the queer community?
Wow, that's a difficult one.
That's a tall one.
That's
right?
a tall one.
Yeah.
I would probably say that certainly over my last 8 or 9 months at Pride, and as you have rightly pointed out, they have been difficult conversations. I'd say the one thing that has stuck out most clearly to me is that I found it was really hard for people to engage with my color, my sexual identity, and the fact that I had children. And I found it was very difficult for people to perhaps, they could see me as the ED of Pride, but perhaps seeing me as a queer woman of color with children, it was harder to engage with me on that level. And I think that that's what a lot of us feel, that it's hard to engage with our many intersecting identities, and that in order for this movement to be truly inclusive, it has to start to grapple with those things.
Wow. Well, I certainly hope that actually takes place.
It is taking place.
I think you've taken on a monumental kind of task. I think the direction that you've discussed here is exciting to get back to that grassroots. You think I've been drinking all afternoon, right?
That's what happens when you're talking all day.
Right, right. I know exactly how you feel. So is it anything else you just want to touch on before we go? And because we've got a few minutes left, and I just want to make sure that you've covered everything that I mean, you've been more than honest with me, and I greatly appreciate that. And I think that's the biggest thing. And I think you're quite the amazing individual. And I've had the pleasure of meeting Bobby and everybody too, and the staff and the volunteers. it's quite an incredible organization.
I think so. I think so. I think, the helpful thing about Pride, what's happened at Pride over the last 3 months, I think has opened the organization up to the community a little more. And so people can truly see what happens internally in the organization. And we are all committed and dedicated to making sure this membership and this community more broadly gets what it wants. And so honestly, mostly I just want people to know that we're working very hard to make sure that we realize what they want to see, and we think this year they'll do that.
I think that's awesome. Thank you, Olivia. I greatly appreciate your time. I know you're a very busy individual, slightly.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're going to go home, drink wine
after
we're done this, right? It's not like you have
I mean?
another function
Literally,
to go to.
Bobby is sitting
right here. Let's go. I can see him right out of the corner of my eye.
I
Right?
know, trust me. You feel him before you see him.
Yep, I know. But thank you very much
No,
for taking the
thank
time
you.
to sit down with us today.
Yeah,
I
not at all.
greatly appreciate that, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where you're going with Pride.
I can't wait, Jason. Can't wait. And we're going to do it together.
We're going to do it together.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
Right.
Because you're not going anywhere.
Right. So we sat down with Olivia and had a conversation about Pride. One of the things that has become very, very clear is the media around Pride seems to be destroying Pride or an attempt to divide the community. The problem is that as a society, we're not checking our sources or going in and actually looking at the story. We're just following along and reading the headlines, and that's good enough, instead of actually asking questions. Like, how many people actually called Pride Toronto and said, are you really allowing the police in the parade? I would suspect that probably hardly anybody. So these are things that we have to really start doing, because as a community, the LGBT community needs to stand together, whether you're a person of color or Asian or whatever. It doesn't make any difference, or you're an old gay white guy. You need to support the community, and you need to support everybody in the community, because if we make a difference for the LGBT community, we make a difference for everybody. And that's what the world is about. Inclusion. No matter who you are or who you love, you are included in our world. And it's time for everybody to stand together, because we always come under attack. And it's time for us to fight back for each other and create space for each other and be allies within our own community, so everybody can have a voice.